Hi everyone, Phil Travis, History 437. This presentation is going to look at some of the more general and broad characteristics relating to the lead up to World War II in Europe in the late 30s, particularly the development of fascism, some of the primary moves taken by Hitler in his move to expand the German state in the late 30s and into the precursors to the invasion of Poland, which occurs, of course, in the fall of 1939. This presentation is also going to look at the Nazi police state and the fundamental role played by the SS in the Nazi police state. So here you see Mussolini, the Italian fascist, who very much Hitler modeled a lot of his things on, and of course Adolf Hitler. I wanted to briefly define fascism. Um, Fascism is extreme nationalism. Sometimes it's referred to as chauvinistic. It's generally militaristic, and it centers around the idea that a nation is made up of a particular race or ethnicity of people. Um, and this view believes that this race or ethnic ah excuse me. So the belief is that this particular race or ethnicity, this group of people that make up the nation, is somehow facing repression at the hands of other particular races and ethnicity, and must expand and purify its territory using largely repressive and militaristic methods. So it promotes the expansion of a racial or an ethnic nation at the expense of other peoples and nations. They would certainly have seen them as kind of lesser civilized people. So it's, in a lot of respects, it's the idea of purifying a nation that you see as fundamentally centered around race. And generally, it's militaristic, and generally, it is based on scapegoating people on the basis of their ethnicity or race. So that's fascism. And of course, in Germany, we all know, Hitler um, most significantly used the Jewish people as the scapegoat, and Hitler promoted what he called Lebensraum, and Lebensraum was a term that means living space. He sought to expand Germany into the areas of Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, and his goal was to create living space for the so-called Aryan people at the expense of the Jewish people and the Slavic peoples and the Russian peoples and the Polish peoples that were all in those areas. Brief rundown. This is just chronology. You don't have to freak out and start scribbling down notes here. I just wanted to give you a rundown of the movement up to World War II. Of course, I mentioned Hitler appointed as chancellor in 1933 after he got 39% of the vote. He begins rearming. He pulls Germany out of the League of Nations. In 1936, Hitler occupies the Rhineland, and the Rhineland was basically a demilitarized zone that was on the border of France. France had, encouraged the creation of this area at the end of World War II for fear of another German invasion. In 1938, Hitler took Austria. He also obtains the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia as a result of the Munich Conference. In 1939, he, of course, invades Poland. After that, he's going to invade Denmark, France, Norway at the beginning, using his blitzkrieg military strategy. Italy's war began in the 30s as well, attempting particularly to recolonize Ethiopia. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1932. By 1937, they invaded China proper. The Japanese theater of war in China was incredibly brutal, not on a scale unlike the Nazis, though there wasn't per se a mass industrial slaughter, but there was tremendous war crimes, horrible war crimes, particularly during the rape of Nanjing in 1937. Japan has to create an empire for the need of resources, and so as a result of that, their imperial goals really do head up against the United States. Here, the area of the Sudetenland, if you look to, as you're facing the screen, if you look to the right and you see the little kind of triangular thing sticking into eastern Germany. That is the so-called Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, and that is what the Allies, with over here on your left is Neville Chamberlain, and of course Hitler's in the middle. The French Prime Minister is between Neville Chamberlain and Hitler. Um, but this is Munich 1938. The Allies made an agreement without even really consulting the Czechoslovakians, actually, to give Germany the Czech Sudetenland. Hitler was demanding it because he said these people were truly German people, and that Germany had a right to control this area. Neville Chamberlain, of course, famously lands in London and steps off the plane with the treaty in his hand, saying, "We've achieved peace in our time." It was one of the most ironic and tragic events in history, because, of course, only a year later the war would really begin as Hitler blitzed into Poland. Chamberlain, of course, would be removed as prime minister and replaced ultimately by Winston Churchill. The SS in Germany, which replaces, of course, the SA. After the SA is purged, the SS replaces the SA. And the SS originally began as Hitler's sort of like personal bodyguard unit. After Hitler obtains absolute authority in Germany with the Enabling Acts of 1933, the SS increasingly expands, and it really becomes the embodiment of, in terms of an ideological respect, an embodiment of Nazi Germany. The SS became a state within a state. It became an authority that really had its loyalty to really none other than Hitler, and before Hitler, Himmler, Heinrich Himmler. And so the SS served a lot of very fundamental functions in Nazi Germany. There was a police unit of the SS known as the Gestapo, which we'll talk about in a moment. There was a military arm of the SS. There were ultimately over 30 military SS divisions that fought with incredible tenacity in particularly the Eastern Front of Russia. And there were also the SS units who were responsible for running and operating the concentration camps. The original duty for the SS, well, not the sole duty, of course, but one of the primary duties for the SS was the running of the concentration camps. And this duty comes down really to the organizational leadership provided by Theodor Eicke. Eicke was given responsibility first with organizing and creating a regimented disciplinary structure for the prison camp at Dachau, which, of course, you see depicted here in the lower left. Eventually, Eicke is given the responsibility of basically organizing the entire concentration camp system. And it is Theodor Eicke who is responsible for training the concentration camp soldiers of the SS and training them to brutally punish prisoners. The concentration camps were incredibly inhumane, and Eicke trained his soldiers to beat prisoners, trained them to particularly treat Jewish prisoners exceptionally poorly, and he trained them to follow orders unflinchingly, and he trained them to inflict extreme physical harm on prisoners without feeling human emotion. Eicke was able to train his soldiers in the concentration camps to basically be ideological Nazi fanatics who would do basically any kind of inhumane action at an order to a prisoner. And the types of punishments in these concentration camps were uniquely brutal. They included exceptionally long periods of solitary confinement. They included Jewish individuals. If there were ever news reports criticizing what Germany were doing in the concentration camps, this would result in very, very harsh solitary confinement of Jewish prisoners at the concentration camps. Soldiers were trained to beat prisoners for basically no particular reason. They were trained um, to use extremely harsh punishment and to do so without feeling human emotions. And Theodore Eicke, who was a particularly fanatic Nazi, really was highly effective in organizing the concentration camps as a brutal, repressive, and inhumane arm of, of repressive and fanatic Nazi ideology. The During Nazi Germany, the SS really was a broad organization that embodied the Nazi police state. The sort of domestic police element of the SS were the Gestapo. And pictured here on the right, you have Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. And here to the left, you have an image depicting citizens that have been stopped and are being searched by the Gestapo in March 1933. Of course, at this very time, this is the time in which the Enabling Act is giving Hitler absolute authority in Germany. The SS was a large apparatus that really operated as the central core of Nazi Germany. The SS made up, in one respect, the soldiers who policed and ran the concentration camps. The SS made up the soldiers like the Einsatzgruppen, who went behind the invasions in places like Poland and rounded up intellectuals and Jews and so forth, and Poles, and killed these people. The SS made up military divisions, and some of the most effective German military divisions of World War II were the military divisions of the Waffen SS, and divisions like the Totenkopf division. The SS also had a domestic police element, and this, of course, was the Gestapo. The Gestapo was legally authorized to operate above the law, beyond the law. And within the SS became like a state within a state. It became a sort of authority within the German state that answered only to Hitler. The mission of the Gestapo was to protect the state from treason, sabotage, espionage, and so forth. Basically, any type of activity that could be deemed subversive. The Gestapo, as part of the SS, ran the concentration camp system, and they had the power to imprison suspects without judicial proceedings. The Gestapo became associated with the police state, and fears of Gestapo agents, informants, and brutal interrogation and imprisonment were vital to keeping the German population submissive to Nazi rule, as the Gestapo could come and arrest you at any time for effectively virtually any type of deemed subversive behavior. In the top picture, you see a picture of Karl von Ossietzky, who was arrested by the Gestapo. Ossietzky was arrested following the Reichstag fire. He was the publisher of a newspaper, The World Stage, and in the newspaper he spoke out against fascism and militarism. And this ultimately, while in Nazi custody, brought him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1935, though he will be subjected to harsh treatment and will succumb to tuberculosis while in custody in May of 1938. Below, you see an image of members of the Gestapo searching the Berlin headquarters of the German Communist Party. As remember, in the early 1933, the German Communist Party was used as one of the primary scapegoats for Hitler to convince the Reichstag to give him complete and total authority to allegedly prevent a communist revolution. The SS, I just want to show you some of the uniforms here. The SS was designed to be the ideological face of the Nazi regime. The SS originally was intended to be a relatively elite group of highly trained, ideologically fanatic Nazis who sort of all fit the mold of the sort of Aryan German individual, blonde hair, blue eyes, what individuals like Himmler saw as the so-called Nordic or Aryan races. Ultimately, by the way, of course, the SS grows to the ranks of 900,000 to 1 million and includes individuals recruited from many countries in Europe, and it very much became multinational rather than something that really embodied that kind of focused ideological model that was originally intended for it. It was designed to cultivate elitism. It was a state within a state. So this is the Nazi police state that has basically ultimate authority. There are no judicial checks on Nazi authority. They really report back to Himmler and ultimately to Hitler only. They are noted for their distinctive black uniforms that set them apart from other members of the German military. They generally create responses of fear, respect, awe. It was presented within the Nazi state as a very high and desirable position. It's also they're also designed to be the most ideological sort of fanatic element of the Nazi movement. The SS were like the on a state police level and on a military level, they were the individuals who were most trained in the ideology of Nazism. And of course, as you will read in Soldiers of Destruction, Theodore Eicke very much uses fanatic Nazi ideology as part of the process of creating an SS soldier. And those who could not hack it were either sent to concentration camps or dismissed. So the Waffen-SS refers to the combat divisions of the SS. And you kind of get a feel, for just how you can see really coming around full circle here with this, you can see how the SS made up this sort of state within a state of the Nazi state, meaning it was a unit that controlled Nazi sort of policing. It was the unit that controlled the Nazi concentration camps and organized these programs around the ideological and racial perspectives of Hitler and Himmler and so forth. And it also served as a large combat army that fought particularly on the Eastern Front. The Waffen-SS, or the combat divisions of the SS, were originally formed in 1940, and they were combined initially by special duty troops and the concentration camp guards that, of course, had received their organizational direction by, of course, Theodore Eicke. And you are reading about one of the most ferocious and merciless of these divisions, and that was the SS Totenkopf Division. Originally, when the Waffen-SS is formed, there's only 5 divisions. By the end of the war, or by 1944, there's 38 divisions and nearly 1 million men. And the Waffen-SS was designed to be sort of, originally, like the SS in general, it was designed to be a sort of microcosm of the fanatical racial Nazi ideology, meaning all the soldiers would sort of represent the sort of Nordic Aryan racial idea for Hitler's ethnic nationalism. Ultimately, they draw and build the SS from nations throughout the conquered realms, and it becomes a very multinational force of around 1 million men. The Waffen-SS divisions, especially the one you're reading about in Soldiers of Destruction, the Totenkopf division, were notorious for their ferocity and their merciless fighting. They were highly effective militarily, but they were also the leading instruments of Nazi racial war policies. So you can see the Nazi SS were basically like the Nazi state apparatus within the state. There was a police body that was above basically all other, judicial and police authority. There was a concentration camp system where all political prisoners, subversives, and individuals that were considered a threat to the sort of racial project of the Nazi ethnic nation. There was also the combat divisions who fought on the Eastern Front. And so you really got to get a feel for how the Waffen-SS is sort of used as Hitler's arm of state control within the German nation, making up the most fanatical frontline sort of Nazi efforts when it comes to policing the streets in Germany, when it comes to going in behind the initial first invasions in Poland and rooting out intellectuals and Jewish people and communists and either killing them or having them sent to concentration camps. The SS relates to the organization of the concentration camps around harsh ideological and racially inhuman means, and also to the most effective combat divisions of the German army. Here you see the SS marching before Adolf Hitler. These troops were uniquely trained to be really ideological Nazis, to be fanatically devoted to the Nazi movement. And of course, the Waffen-SS also ultimately recruits from other nations throughout Europe as the Nazis conquer other European nations. The Nazis build recruits from these nations and ultimately use propaganda to encourage these individuals to join the SS to fight communism, Bolshevism, and so forth. So to conclude, I want to just summarize the SS and its multiple roles in Nazi Germany. The SS was the Nazi police state. It was a state within a state that reported only to Hitler. It was indispensable to the maintenance of the Nazi regime. They ran the concentration camps. They acted as the police in the streets who rooted out subversives. And even militarily, they made up the most ferocious and effective military units of the war. Control of the police, plus ownership over ideological interpretation and application, gave the SS an unbeatable set of assets that enabled it to become a state within a state that was answerable only to Hitler. And finally, Himmler's fanatical racist ideology plus his own drive for power, and you saw this too with Theodor Eicke. Theodor Eicke was just as fanatical in his racist ideology in his training of the SS in the concentration camps at Dachau, and in the organization of the SS Totenkopf division, would set the stage for the SS to become the primary force behind the Holocaust. So I hope this is helpful. This is a SS recruiting poster you see here, and you can tell here it presents to a young German, it presents joining the SS as a very idealized and glorified decision for a young person to make in Germany.